All right, guys, today we're going to talk about Chapter 17, the respiratory system. Certainly is a pretty important system as it's going to help oxygenate our blood, and so many of our tissues certainly rely on oxygen. On average, we breathe about 23,000 times in 24 hours. So again, a job that's kind of happening pretty continuously. The heart and the lungs work very closely together. We talk about them as being kind of a married system who really can't get divorced, or we cause a lot of problems. And not only does the respiratory system play a role in oxygen, but it also plays a role in sound production, speech, smell, taste, and acid-base balance. So let's start talking about the different components. So we have an upper respiratory tract and we have a lower respiratory tract. Upper respiratory tract consists of structures outside of the thoracic cavity. So those would be the nose, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, all which are part of the pharynx, and then the larynx. These structures' jobs really are to warm and humidify inspired air. They also can sometimes catch things as we inhale them to prevent them from getting to our lungs. Also responsible for smell, taste, chewing, swallowing. The lower respiratory tract consists of structures located inside the thoracic cavity. Those would be the trachea, the bronchi, and then the lungs. And the lungs really are the primary structure here. So let's talk about each of these structures individually. The nose and the nasal cavities. This is really where air enters and leaves the respiratory system. There's some hairs inside here called cilia. Then there's some of those processes that help to catch dust and large foreign particles before we inhale them. The nasal cavity is separated from the mouth by a bony structure called the palate. So you can see there that we have a hard palate and a soft palate. Hard palate really is the roof of our mouth. We also have a vertical plate of bone and cartilage called the septum, which separates the nasal cavity into two halves. Sometimes we talk about people having a deviated septum, and that doesn't allow for them to breathe good through one nostril. We also have these three bones that kind of protrude from the wall of each of the nasal cavities called the conchae. Okay, they warm and moisten air as it flows past. They really help to increase surface area. It allows dust to stick to the mucus, which is then swallowed instead of entering into the respiratory system. We also have the sinuses entering into the nasal cavity. They help to drain mucus into the nasal cavity from the rest of our kind of facial structures. The pharynx is our next structure. It's really divided into three different areas. Okay, and the names should help you to kind of understand where they're located. So just behind the nasal and oral cavities is where the majority of the pharynx is located. The nasopharynx lies just behind the soft palate. So this structure here is the soft palate. Okay, really close to the nasal cavity. We have the oral cavity, which really sits at the back of the throat. Okay, at the base of the tongue, contains the palatine and the lingual tonsils that we talked about last chapter. We have the laryngopharynx, which is the lowest part of the pharynx, passes dorsal to the larynx and connects to the esophagus. So this is the esophagus here, and we branch off to the larynx here, which is the continuation of the respiratory tract. Only air passes through the nasopharynx, whereas both food and air pass through the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. So just a differentiating feature there. The larynx, as we continue down, really helps to prevent food and liquids from entering the trachea. It acts as the air passageway between the pharynx and the trachea and helps to produce sound. So this is where we have some of our vocal cords lying. And if you look on page 329 in your book, it shows you the vocal cords and how they close and open, and that's how we actually create sound. So if people have to have their larynx removed, that's when they're going to have difficulties with speech production. So the larynx is really formed by 9 pieces of cartilage, and those are kind of strong, stiff cartilage to help it keep it from collapsing. The esophagus, on the other hand, is very collapsible, so it allows for expansion and contraction. The larynx, on the other hand, is pretty stiff and stays open. We certainly want our airway to stay opened. The epiglottis, which closes over the top of the larynx during swallowing to direct food and liquids into the esophagus. Okay, this is this little flap kind of here. So when we're eating, it closes and allows the food to pass down through the esophagus. The largest piece of the cartilage here in the larynx is the thyroid cartilage, also known as the Adam's apple. So you usually can palpate that on something. Some people, it's more prominent in men. The mucous membrane lining the larynx forms two pairs of folds. The superior pair closes the glottis, okay? And the inferior pair is actually the vocal cords, which produces sound when air passes over them. The opening between the cords is called the glottis, okay? So you can see here there's lots of different structures on pointing to this area here. The lower respiratory tract, as we said, consists of trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So let's talk about those structures now. The trachea lies in front of the esophagus. Okay, you see how it's got these C-shaped rings of cartilage. They encircle the trachea to reinforce it and keep it from collapsing. The open part of the C faces posteriorly as the esophagus runs back there. We want to give the esophagus a little bit of room to expand during swallowing. At the carina, the trachea branches into two primary bronchi, which are also supported by C-shaped rings of cartilage. The right bronchus is slightly wider and more vertical than the left, which makes it the most likely location for somebody to aspirate food or liquids into the respiratory tract. So often, if somebody has what we call an aspiration pneumonia or they aspirated some food, it's going to go into the right bronchi. The primary bronchi in this diagram is shaded green. So if you're looking at the right lung there, it's green, okay? That's the primary bronchi. Then branches into secondary bronchi, one for each of the lobes, lungs lobes. So we have two on the left and three on the right. So you can see here we have 3 lobes on the right, 2 lobes on the left, okay? So we get one primary bronchi labeled in yellow here for each lobe. Then they branch into tertiary bronchi. They're shaded in orange. The tertiary bronchi continue to branch, resulting in very small airways called bronchioles. Those are shaded in purple. They eventually become these thin-walled passages called alveolar ducts, and then they become clusters of alveoli. The alveoli are the structures where actual gas exchange happens. So they're the primary functioning structure associated with gas exchange in the lungs. So this is what they look like. They kind of look like little sacks of grapes. They're wrapped with this fine mesh of capillaries, and that's actually where gas exchange happens. The walls of the alveoli and the walls of the capillary are very, very thin, so it allows for very efficient gas exchange. We also get the inside of each of the alveoli coated with a thin layer of fluid called surfactant. It's a substance that helps reduce surface tension. It allows the alveoli it prevents the alveoli from collapsing as air moves in and out. If the alveoli collapse every time we exhale, it's a lot of work to pop those alveoli open. So this little fluid called surfactant helps to keep a little bit of surface tension on them that prevents them from collapsing. If you look in your book on page 331, it actually shows a little bit of gas exchange happening in that little circular box off of this picture we're looking at here. You can see how thin those little walls are, okay? And that's what allows the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to diffuse across, right? We want the oxygen to diffuse across the membrane into the capillary system where it'll latch onto the red blood cells. And then we have the red blood cells dropping off the carbon dioxide, the waste products that it picked up from the cells, drops it off there into the alveoli, which then we exhale out. Okay, so we're going to talk more about gas exchange as we continue. The next structure really is the lungs, okay? The lungs fill the pleural cavity, okay? The top or the apex of each lung extends about a half inch above the first rib, and the base of each lung rests on the diaphragm. So you can see the diaphragm there. It's kind of this umbrella-shaped structure. It's a muscular structure that's going to assist us in inhaling and exhaling. The right lung is shorter, broader, and larger than the left. It has 3 lobes and handles about 55% of gas exchange. The left lung only has 2 lobes, the superior and the inferior, and it's a little bit smaller. And you can probably see why it's a little bit smaller, but we have to accommodate for the structures of the heart. So that's why that lung is just a little bit smaller and only has 2 lobes instead of 3 lobes. So in total, we have 5 lobes of the lungs. This is a cross-section picture, so you can see it looks like we actually took, and sliced someone right under, this woman underneath her breast. And we're looking kind of downward into her lungs. Okay, this is a serous membrane, so we talked about that in the beginning of A&P. And a serous membrane always consists of 2 different coverings, and we get a little bit of fluid, right, serous fluid in between those membranes. And here that serous fluid really plays a role in lubricating the pleural surfaces and allows the 2 surfaces to glide across each other and allows lung expansion and contraction. It also, when the lungs are expanding and contracting, there's a little bit of atmospheric pressure in that cavity, and that also creates a pressure gradient that assists in lung inflation. So here we have the parietal pleural, which lines the entire thoracic cavity. Okay, so that's that green membrane there. Okay, kind of comes over and turns back on itself and becomes the visceral pleural. And that space really in between is what we call the pleural cavity. That's where that serous fluid is, and that's where we're going to get a little bit of pressure difference to help with inflation of the lungs. So now we talked about the structures, we really have to talk about the physiology of what's happening in the lungs. And really that's ventilation. Okay, we have 2 main concepts: perfusion and ventilation. The heart perfuses the oxygenated blood to the body, and the lungs ventilate. So they create inspiration and expiration. Okay, it really is just this repetitive process. Ventilation is just this repetitive process of inhaling and exhaling. Okay, 1 inhalation, 1 exhalation equals 1 respiratory cycle. Okay. Both of these things depend on respiratory muscles and differences between air pressure within the lungs and outside of the body. So this is more where the system is going to get a little bit more conceptual in nature, and we're going to need to talk about how this really happens. So we have some muscles that play a role in this. The main muscle responsible for pulmonary ventilation is the diaphragm, which I already talked with you about. It's this umbrella-shaped structure that sits at the base of the lungs, goes all the way across the bottom here. During inspiration, the external intercostals pull the ribs upward and outward, widening the thoracic cavity. The internal intercostals also help elevate the ribs. The diaphragm contracts, which means it flattens and drops, pressing the abdominal organs downward, enlarging the thoracic cavity, and air rushes in to equalize pressure. What happens is that as that diaphragm is pulling the lungs down and expanding that thoracic cavity, we get a change in pressure inside the cavity, and that's actually what causes air to rush in. On expiration, the internal intercostal muscles relax, the diaphragm relaxes, pushing back upward, pressing against the base of the lungs, reducing the size of the thoracic cavity, and air is pushed out of the lungs. So really, inspiration is an active process, and exhalation, regular exhalation, is just a very passive process. It's really just relaxation of different muscles. If we want to force an exhalation or expiration, then we get it being a more active process. But most of the time when we're breathing, it's a very passive process because we're not forcing exhalation to happen. But when we do have deep inspiration or forced expiration, we get these accessory muscles of respiration to help us. And those are muscles of the neck, the pectoris minor, the rectus abdominis, the external abdominal obliques. All of those are accessory abdominal muscles. These 3 over here are the primary respiratory muscles. So we also get a little neural control of breathing because the nervous system plays a role in almost all of our body. So unlike the heart, the muscles used for breathing are actually skeletal muscles, which requires nervous system stimulation to contract. You remember the heart muscles didn't require that. They just contract on their own. Unconscious breathing resides in the medulla in the pons. So back to that cardiac respiratory center there in the brainstem. The medulla contains two interconnected centers that control breathing, the inspiratory center and the expiratory center. The inspiratory center is the primary respiratory center. It controls inspiration and indirectly expiration. The inspiratory center sends impulses to the intercostal muscles and to the diaphragm. This causes the inspiratory muscles to contract, causing inhalation. When those nerves stop being stimulated, it causes the inspiratory muscles to relax and therefore produces exhalation. The apneustic and the pneumotaxic centers are in the pons. These influence basic breathing rhythms, okay? The expiratory center sends impulses to the abdominal and accessory muscles if we need it. So most of the time we have the inspiratory center driving inhalation and exhalation. The apneustic and the pneumotaxic center affect rate and depth of inhalation and exhalation. And the expiratory center really comes into play when we need to have forceful exhalations. Lots of different factors that influence breathing. There's a chart in your book that walks through all of these things too. Gives you a lot of great descriptive factors. So we have many sensory receptors throughout the body that let the respiratory center know what needs to happen. So this is a little bit outside of the regular neural control of breathing. These things can affect the respiratory center as well. So we have peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies, right? So we talked about those before. They can detect low blood levels of oxygen and signal the medulla to increase rate and depth of respiration to bring in more oxygen. We also have central chemoreceptors in the brainstem that detect increasing pH levels and signal the respiratory centers to increase rate and depth of breathing to blow off excess carbon dioxide and lower pH. Most people think that our respiratory center is driven by oxygen levels, but it's really driven by carbon dioxide levels. Okay, so usually the pH and the amount of carbon dioxide levels triggers our breathing more so than the percentage of oxygen. We have receptors in the lung and chest wall that detect stretching and signal respiratory centers to exhale if we have too much stretch. We have the hypothalamus and the limbic system alter breathing in response to emotions, right? Everyone's been in pain, been crying, been visibly upset, and hopefully been able to recognize that it's affecting our respiratory center. And then we have nerve cells in our airways that respond to irritants by signaling muscles to contract, causing us to cough or sneeze when we come in contact with some sort of irritant. So let's talk more about how inspiration and exhalation actually happen, okay? And again, this is all related to pressure. Atmospheric pressure is the weight of the air around us, okay? And this atmospheric pressure really drives the respiration. The respiratory system functions on a pressure gradient just like blood flow does. So, as blood flow gets to the tissues and it has a lot of pressure in it in the aortic side, it pushes things out of it. Well, in order to get inhalation and exhalation, pressure drives this system as well. When pressure within the lungs drops lower than atmospheric pressure, air flows in, right? Just like we've talked about in the past, that elevator that's really, really full of people, when the doors open and there's less pressure outside that elevator, people are going to rush out. So when the air pressure drops low in the lungs, lower than the air pressure outside of the lungs, air is going to naturally flow in, just based on that pressure gradient. When pressure within the lungs rise above the atmospheric pressure, then airflow is going to go out. Pretty straightforward concept, but let's talk through all the different steps here. Okay, so we have, during inspiration, a number of things are really happening. We have the internal intercostals, we just have the internal and external intercostal muscles contracting, pulling the ribs up and out. The diaphragm contracts and moves down. This enlarges the chest cavity, in all directions. The lungs expand along with the chest because of those two layers of pleural, right? We have the parietal pleural, which is attached to the ribs. The visceral pleural covers the lungs. There's a little bit of serous fluid in between them that helps them kind of stick together. So this potential space between the pleural remains slightly less than atmospheric pressure. Okay, this is the interpleural pressure. When the ribs expand and the parietal pleural pulls away, the interpleural pressure becomes even more negative. This has a suction-like effect, causing the visceral pleural to cling even tighter to the parietal pleural. The visceral pleural follows the parietal pleural, pulling the lungs along with it. So all of this, the muscles contracting, the diaphragm moving downward, causing the chest to expand, the pleural membranes wanting to kind of stick close to each other, causes the lungs to expand. The volume of the air in the lungs spreads throughout the enlarging space. This causes the pressure within the bronchi and the alveoli to drop. This is called interpulmonic pressure. When the interpulmonic pressure drops lower than the atmospheric pressure, air flows down the pressure gradient into the lungs. So all of these things happen which cause the intrapulmonic pressure to drop lower than atmospheric pressure, then air naturally flows into the lungs. Expiration, on the other hand, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax. The thoracic cage springs back to its original size. The lungs are compressed by the thoracic cage. Interpulmonic pressure rises. As that pressure rises and becomes greater than the pressure outside of the lungs, then the air flows down the pressure gradient and out of the lungs. So let's watch the book's animation on this. All right, so my computer does not want to play that animation for whatever reason, so we'll watch it in class. But they're always on Davis Plus, so you guys can go and watch them there as well. So there are a couple factors that affect airflow: pulmonary compliance and alveolar surface tension. So pulmonary compliance refers to the elasticity of lung tissue. It should be pretty elastic. We want it to expand and contract. Ventilation cannot occur unless the lungs and thorax can stretch and recoil. There are some diseases that cause scarring and make the lungs stiff. The lungs then have difficulty expanding and ventilation is impaired. So we want to make sure we have good pulmonary compliance. Alveolar surface tension is related to the inner surface of each alveoli that's covered with that thin film of water, okay, and surfactant, which is necessary for gas exchange. However, water molecules are electrically attracted to each other. Left alone, the water molecules will move toward each other and collapse the alveoli. If the alveoli collapse, gas exchange cannot occur. So to avoid this problem, we have the surfactant, which is the lipoprotein that disrupts the electrical attraction between the water molecules, and this lowers surface tension and prevents alveolar collapse. Okay, so it's really important that we have enough surface tension, but not too much to prevent alveolar collapse, because then we're not going to get gas exchange. There are some measurements of ventilation that you need to know, so you have to memorize these. Tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled and exhaled during just normal, quiet breathing. Okay. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air exhaled using inhaled. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air inhaled using maximum effort after a normal inspiration. So it's like normal inspiration, and then you decide to take even a larger breath. So expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be exhaled after a normal expiration by using maximum effort. The residual volume is the air that remains in the lungs after a forced expiration. So there's always a small amount of air, about 1,300 mils, that stay in the lungs after we have the largest forced expiration, and it continues to help us with gas exchange even between breaths. Vital capacity is the amount of air that can be inhaled and exhaled with the deepest possible breath. So it's like tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume plus expiratory reserve volume. And then total lung capacity is the maximum amount of air that the lungs can contain. So it's all of those things together. Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual volume all together is total lung capacity. So you'll just have to spend some time looking over those concepts in your book, make some flashcards on them, and just make sure you commit those to memory. So the last couple slides here are going to be related to gas exchange. Okay, we already talked about how inspiration and expiration depends on differences in pressures, but a gas exchange also is a result of pressure. So gas diffuses from higher to lower pressures until pressures are equalized. So that's how we get oxygen to the tissues and removal of carbon dioxide. That's really the goal of the respiratory system. So room air is about 21% oxygen and about 0.3% carbon dioxide. So we get exchanges based on these pressures. The contribution of a single gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure. So a gas has a partial pressure symbolized by the letter P, followed by the formula for the gas. So PCO2 is telling you the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide vary between the air we breathe, the alveoli, the arterial blood, and the venous blood. That makes sense, right? All of those different areas are going to have different concentrations or partial pressures of those gases. These variations in pressure allow the body to absorb oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. The differences in partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide on either side of the respiratory membrane cause O2 to move out of the alveoli into the capillaries and carbon dioxide to move out of the capillaries into the alveoli. The CO2 is later then exhaled through the lungs, right? We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier when we were looking at the membrane of the alveoli. Optimum exchange depends on pressure gradients between oxygen in the alveoli air and oxygen in incoming pulmonary blood, adequate alveolar surface area, and adequate respiratory rate. So all of those things help the pressure gradient. So let's look at the transport of oxygen. Of the oxygen entering the body, only 1.5% is dissolved in blood plasma. The remaining amount of oxygen travels to the lungs where it forms this weak bond with the iron portion of hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. We talked about that in the chapter on blood. Oxyhemoglobin travels to the cells where the difference between venous and arterial pH actually breaks the bond and oxygen is released to the tissues. Right? So the capillaries come to the alveoli. We have a large amount of oxygen in the alveoli, a small amount of oxygen in the capillaries. Okay, so we have a pressure difference. Oxygen flows into the capillaries, right, into the blood. The blood has a high amount of carbon dioxide. The alveoli have a small amount of carbon dioxide, so the reverse happens. Carbon dioxide goes into the alveoli and is exhaled. The oxygen, the red blood cells, the hemoglobin and the red blood cells pick up the oxygen, forms this oxyhemoglobin, travels to the cells or the tissues that need it, right, to a capillary bed. There's a pH difference in the venous and arterial blood. It actually breaks that bond. The oxygen is released. Okay, it flows into the tissues because there's a low amount of oxygen in the tissues. Transport of carbon dioxide occurs in a couple of different ways. So carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin forms carbamine hemoglobin. So hemoglobin can transport both oxygen and CO2 at the same time because they bind to different sites of the hemoglobin molecule, which we talked about before as well. Most carbon dioxide is carried in the form of bicarbonate ions, though. Okay, this occurs because carbon dioxide dissolves in plasma, reacts with the water in plasma to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissociates or breaks apart into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So that's where we get most of our transport of carbon dioxide, but it still moves, okay, in the same way. That's how it moves back to the respiratory system through the venous system is one of these ways. It gets back to the lungs, gets in the capillary bed around those alveoli, diffuses across that membrane into the alveoli, and then we exhale it to get rid of it. I want you to look on page 340, and there are a couple terms that I want you to know. Variations in respiratory rhythm. So apnea means no breathing. Dyspnea means labored or difficult breathing. And tachypnea is rapid breathing. So you need to know those three different terms as well. So I think it's important. Let's see if we can get that other animation, because there is an animation on gas exchange. And if not, we'll watch it. We'll watch it in class. It's just working really slow today. Yeah, it's just going really slow. So let's watch in class. But page 342, the process of gas exchange, is really, really helpful if you're confused about how this gas exchange is happening. So read over that, and then we're going to do some activities in class that are a little bit more related to this gas exchange as well. So it'll help you to understand the gas exchange.